What if the next global conflict doesn't begin with an invasion, but with a quiet shift in power that most people don't even notice? Because right now, behind closed doors in Beijing, Washington, Brussels, and Moscow, strategists are quietly preparing for a world that could look dramatically different in just the next 2 to 4 years. And according to one Chinese professor whose analysis has been spreading rapidly across geopolitical circles, the next phase of global power competition may already be unfolding. He has been known in academic and policy communities as a sharp geopolitical thinker who studies not only military strategy, but also the psychology of civilizations, the dynamics of power transitions, and the historical patterns that repeat when global orders begin to shift. And recently, he offered a prediction about the next 2 to 4 years that has caught the attention of analysts around the world. Not because it sounds dramatic, but because when you examine the evidence, it feels disturbingly plausible. But before we get to that prediction, we need to understand the moment the world is currently living through. Because right now, the international system is under enormous strain. On one side, the United States and its network of alliances still represent the most powerful military and financial system in modern history. But on the other side, China is rising rapidly, not just economically, but technologically, militarily, and strategically. And that shift alone would already create tension. But what makes the current situation far more dangerous is that multiple flashpoints are heating up simultaneously. And this is where Professor Jiang's analysis becomes particularly interesting, because he argues that the next phase of global competition will not necessarily start with a sudden dramatic war. Instead, it may unfold through a series of smaller strategic moves, each one slowly reshaping the balance of power. But here's the part that many people overlook. The next 4 years may be the most critical window. Why? Because several long-term trends are converging at the same time. First, there's the military balance in the Indo-Pacific. Over the past decade, China has dramatically expanded its naval forces. Shipyards along the Chinese coast have been producing warships at a pace not seen since the height of the Cold War. Meanwhile, new missile systems designed to challenge American aircraft carriers are becoming more advanced. But this buildup isn't only about numbers, it's about geography. The Western Pacific is a region where distance, logistics, and supply lines determine who has the advantage. And China happens to be operating very close to home. But what happens if that balance begins to shift even slightly? Because according to Jiang, the most sensitive point in the entire geopolitical chessboard is not Ukraine. And it's not the Middle East either, it's Taiwan. And this is where things become far more complicated. Taiwan is not just a political dispute. It is also the center of the global semiconductor industry. Some of the most advanced chips in the world are manufactured there. The same chips that power artificial intelligence, smartphones, fighter jets, and advanced weapon systems. Which means any disruption there would ripple across the entire global economy. But what makes Jiang's prediction fascinating is that he does not believe the situation will necessarily explode in the way people imagine. In fact, he argues that the next few years may be defined by something more subtle: strategic pressure. Instead of a full-scale invasion, the world might see gradual escalation, economic pressure, military signaling, gray zone tactics, naval patrols, cyber operations, political influence campaigns, and each step would push the boundaries without immediately triggering a global war. But this is where the timeline becomes critical. Because within the next 2 to 4 years, several factors could reshape the strategic environment. One of them is military readiness. China's armed forces have been undergoing rapid modernization. New hypersonic missile technologies, expanded submarine fleets, and advanced air defense systems are all changing the regional balance. But that doesn't automatically mean conflict is inevitable, because the other side of the equation is the United States and its allies. And over the past few years, Washington has been strengthening military partnerships across the region. Japan is expanding its defense spending, Australia is investing in submarine programs, and regional alliances are becoming increasingly interconnected. But here's where Jiang introduces a concept that many analysts find intriguing. He argues that the real contest over the next few years may not be decided purely by weapons. Instead, it may be determined by economic resilience. Because modern geopolitical competition is fought not only on battlefields, but also through supply chains, energy networks, financial systems, technology ecosystems. And if one side can outmaneuver the other economically, it can reshape the strategic environment without firing a single shot. But this leads to another question. Why the specific window of 2 to 4 years? Because according to Jiang's framework, power transitions often accelerate during periods of global distraction. And right now, the world is facing multiple simultaneous crises. The war in Ukraine has already reshaped European security. Energy markets remain volatile. Global debt levels are rising, and technological competition between major powers is intensifying. In other words, the international system is stretched thin. But what happens when several of these pressures collide? Because historically, moments like this have often produced unexpected turning points. Consider the early 20th century. At that time, the global order was also undergoing massive transformation. New powers were rising, old alliances were shifting, and economic interdependence created the illusion that major war was impossible. But as history shows, assumptions can collapse quickly. And this is exactly why Jiang's prediction is drawing so much attention. He suggests that the next phase of geopolitical competition may not look like the wars of the past. Instead of massive armies crossing borders overnight, the world may experience something slower, but equally transformative. Strategic positioning, political influence, economic fragmentation, technological blocks. But there is another layer to this analysis, because the internal dynamics within major powers also matter. Domestic politics, economic growth, public opinion, leadership decisions. All of these factors can influence whether tensions escalate or stabilize. And this is where the next few years become particularly unpredictable, because political transitions are occurring across multiple countries. New leaders may emerge, policies may shift, alliances may adapt, and each of those changes can alter the strategic calculations of rival powers. But there's one more element in Jiang's framework that deserves attention: psychology. Great power competition is not only about capabilities, it is also about perception. How leaders interpret the intentions of others, how they evaluate risks, how they react to pressure. And sometimes miscalculations can trigger events that no one originally intended. But this leads us to the most controversial part of Jiang's prediction. He believes the next 2 to 4 years may represent a decisive testing period, not necessarily for war, but for the future structure of the global order. Because if current trends continue, the world may gradually move toward a more fragmented system. Multiple power centers, regional blocks, competing economic ecosystems, different technological standards. In other words, the end of a single dominant global framework. But what would that actually look like? One possibility is a world where economic globalization slows dramatically. Countries prioritize strategic industries. Supply chains become regional rather than global. Technology ecosystems split into separate spheres. And geopolitical competition becomes the defining feature of international relations. But there is also another scenario, one where tensions stabilize through deterrence, where major powers avoid direct conflict, but remain locked in a long-term strategic rivalry, a kind of 21st century Cold War. But here's the twist. Jiang suggests that the outcome of this transition may depend less on military confrontation and more on which system proves more adaptable, which economies innovate faster, which alliances remain cohesive, which political systems maintain stability. Because in long-term strategic competition, endurance matters just as much as strength. But perhaps the most striking part of Jiang's analysis is his warning about complacency. He argues that many societies tend to underestimate how quickly geopolitical landscapes can change. One decade, the world appears stable. The next decade, entirely new power structures emerge. And that's exactly why the next 2 to 4 years may be so important. Because decisions being made right now about technology, alliances, energy, and economic policy could shape the balance of power for decades. And if there's one lesson history repeatedly teaches, it's that global orders rarely change gradually. They shift during moments when pressure builds quietly, until suddenly the system rearranges itself. So the real question may not be whether tensions exist. They clearly do. The real question is how the world navigates the coming window of uncertainty. Because if Professor Jiang's analysis proves correct, the next 2 to 4 years may not simply be another chapter in geopolitics. They may be the moment when the next global era quietly begins.